great American writer David Foster Wallace was once giving a speech at a university graduation, and he began with a story about two fish. These two fish were swimming upriver when an older fish swam past the other way. "Morning, boys," said the older fish. "Lovely water today." And the two fish nodded politely, moved on, and then one turned to the other and said, "What on earth's water?" And Wallace was using the story to try and persuade the students listening that the thing they're most likely to miss is the environment in which they've grown up. Some things are so close to us we just don't see them. Wallace meant not so much the physical environment as the culture in which these students had been educated. We're quick to see, aren't we, how cultures shape people's beliefs if those cultures are different from our own. So we've got an explanation as to why the young boy growing up in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia becomes a Muslim. He's shaped by his family and his parents, his education and schooling, his culture, what he sees on television and hears on the radio. It's not that he's thought things through and decided to become a Muslim. No, he's been shaped by the rivers in which he swims. And the same explanation works for the child who becomes a Buddhist in the Himalayan mountains, or indeed a Roman Catholic in medieval Britain. What we're perhaps less good at is turning the camera around and focusing on ourselves, thinking about the waters in which we swim. How much of what I believe, how many of the things that I think are the product not so much of a cold clinical thinking process, but rather swimming in the waters of my culture. Now, the reason I started here is we might as well admit at the outset that Christianity looks very strange to those of us who've been brought up in late 20th, early 21st century Western culture. If you know anything about Christianity and the stories of the Gospels, you might know that they centre on this man, Jesus, who claims to be God. When you read these historical accounts, you see Jesus giving sight to the blind. You see him healing the sick. The lame can walk at his touch. On one occasion, he himself walks on water. He stops a storm with just a word. Ultimately, he's crucified, dies, is buried, and comes back to life 3 days later. And we just know it can't be true. I mean, it may be inspiring as a story, but it's not true truth. You'd have to be mad to believe it. And yet, at the moment, there are 2.3 billion people around the world who claim that it is true truth. 2.3 billion Christians, by far the biggest religion, by far the biggest and most popular understanding of life, the universe, and everything. Are they all mad? Are they all thick? Well, possibly. Or possibly, if Christianity seems mad to us at first glance, it's more about the waters in which we've swam than our own clinical thinking. So yes, Christianity seems unbelievable, but it always does to whatever culture it meets. The Roman culture in which Christianity was birthed thought Christianity was mad because Christians taught that all people were equal, irrespective of who they were or where they were from, that men and women were equal. Rubbish, said the Romans. Of course men are better than women. That's why if you had a baby girl, you could leave it on the rubbish dump to die with no prosecution. It was a girl. Of course, slaves and masters are equal, said Christianity. Rubbish, said the Romans. Of course, masters are more valuable than scumbag slaves. If you want to beat your slave to death, go for it. Think of the Viking culture. Again, dismissing Christianity initially because Christianity taught that you should forgive your enemies. Ridiculous. Mad, thought the Vikings. So much so that one poor Viking king who became a Christian was then killed by his brothers after he forgave some of his enemies. Christianity has always seemed mad to whichever culture it's encountered. And yet it has grown and grown and grown. That means I want to say two things as we begin these 4 sessions. The first is that Christianity is not asking you to switch off your brain and take a leap in the dark. And that's often how faith is portrayed, isn't it? If you've seen the Indiana Jones movies, you might know there's a moment where he comes to this great chasm he needs to cross. There's no bridge, he can't climb up and down, and his map tells him he needs to take the leap of faith. So poor old Indy closes his eyes, screws up his courage, and steps out into the abyss. And lo and behold, there's an invisible bridge there to support his weight. Faith is portrayed that way, isn't it? As if it's a leap in the dark against the evidence. And yet that's not at all the way the Bible presents things. You're not asked to switch your brain off when you come to the door of church. That's why, incidentally, any and every question is welcome. Please don't feel anything is too rude or too offside to ask. Christianity can stand up to examination. But it's worth saying too, and being clear at the start, that what Christianity, or more specifically Jesus, is asking of us is a radical change. Jesus' first recorded words when he begins his preaching ministry are repent and believe the message about me. I believe we sort of have a bit of a feel for what he's asking. But with repent, what he's doing is asking us to turn around, to change, to swim against the river, as it were. It will be uncomfortable if everything Jesus says is true. It'll mean we can't just go with the flow of the culture around us at all times. And so the key question, of course, is it true? Or is it just total madness? The waters around us will want to dismiss it as madness. But I want to encourage us to take a look and really think for ourselves. There's another parable often attributed to the philosopher Nietzsche, who was himself an implacable enemy of Christianity. And it tells of a man walking towards a village. As he gets closer, he sees the men and women dancing, and yet he can hear no music. And so the question is, are the villagers mad? Because there's another possibility, isn't there? One option is they are indeed mad, dancing when there's no music. Or it could be that the traveller himself is just deaf. As the punchline goes, those who were dancing were thought insane by those who couldn't hear the music. So our key question really is there music? Is Christianity singing a song? Or are those who adhere to it just simply mad? So let's dive in and look at one of life's big questions. We'll take 4 questions over the next 4 sessions, and today's is very simply, who are we? Who are we as human beings? The streams in which we swim, I think, give us 2 main answers. The first is the answer of materialism. Materialism very simply says, you are what you eat. You are what you eat. And the materialist answer is given by those who believe that science is the only tool we can use to give explanations. And so the chemist says, well, if you want to know who you are as a human being, then you're made up, 99% at least, of 6 elements. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium and phosphorus. And a few little small ones chucked in to top up the last percent. You are ultimately an equation, says the chemist. The biologist phrases it rather differently. You're a meat robot. Or the physicist looks even more closely at the atoms, the protons, the neutrons, the electrons. But either way, ultimately the point is the same. You are just stuff. There is no soul or mind or spirit. There's no real you. Richard Dawkins, an active atheist campaigner, says this: what are all of us but self-reproducing robots? Or Francis Crick, another scientist who tries to campaign for atheism, says this: you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Your very sense of self is an illusion. It's just molecules deluding you. That's why G.K. Chesterton, a Christian writer, says the atheist is someone who looks in the mirror and sees nobody. Because there is no real you. You're just matter in motion. Well, the second understanding pushes back against this materialist approach and says, no, it's not that you are what you eat, but rather you are what you feel. This is the answer of mysticism, we might say. You can be anything you want to be. It's what is on the inside that counts. We're not just atoms and molecules. There's a real you, and you can be and you can decide whatever you want to be. In some ways, the patron saint might be Queen Elsa of Rivendell. Let it go, she sings. Don't be constrained by society. Don't let your parents or teachers tell you who you ought to be. Truth comes from within, and it's up to you to make it up. The other day I was watching a film with my children, a cartoon, and in it a little fox wanted to grow up to be an elephant. So he bought himself some little elephant ears and an elephant trunk. And we laugh. But another character comes to him and says, well, you can be anything you want. You could grow up to be an elephant. And it's sort of sweet and funny because it's a cartoon. But actually, it tracks very much with the currents in which we swim nowadays. To take the most obvious example, I think of the area of gender. Even as recently as 10, 20 years ago, for someone to say I'm a man in a woman's body would have been met with total confusion. What do you mean? We're defined by our biology. If you are biologically male, you are a male. You can't be a woman trapped in a man's body or vice versa. And yet today that's something that many are totally on board with. And that leads us actually to an interesting clash between these two cultures, materialism and mysticism. You can't hold to both. Ultimately, they need to or want to devour one another. So the mysticist says to the materialist, what you're teaching that would just matter, it's a nonsense. It makes no sense. It destroys everything we are. It destroys love. It destroys also rationality. Ultimately, molecules can't think, can they? Chemical equations can't reason and debate. If I was to shake up a can of Sprite and a can of Coke and sort of click the lids and they were to buzz here in front of me, no one would ask which one is winning the argument, which one is winning the debate. No, they're just chemicals buzzing. Well, similarly, if human beings are just complicated chemical equations, then it destroys any kind of rationality, any kind of ability we might have to think for ourselves. In fact, the very reason that Richard Dawkins is an atheist is not because he's cleverly thought it all through on his own understanding. Rather, it must be because the particular chemicals that make up his body were always going to think that way and speak that way under those conditions. We are ultimately robots. But the materialist bites back and says to the mystic, where's your grounds? Where is this mysterious you that's on the inside? What evidence do you have for what you believe? Again, one of the most vehement arguments we see at the moment is between those who want to argue for transgenderism, that you are the gender you feel, and those, particularly feminists, who say, what are you talking about? If you are biologically male, don't presume to understand what it means to be female. That is a clash between two worldviews, the mystic and the materialist. But I want to suggest there's a better way. If the materialist says you are what you eat, the mystic says you are what you feel, the good news of Christianity is that we are what God made us. Or you are who God made you to be. You were created, intended, purposed. Now, as soon as I start talking about God making us, the science alarm bell goes off, doesn't it? Part of the waters in which we swim, one of the things that those waters have told us is that you can't believe in both science and Christianity. You must choose. And let me say very gently, that is nonsense. We haven't got time to do a deep dive on the whole topic of Christianity and science right now. But even a surface look tells us that it just isn't a choice between the two. Albert Einstein had 3 pictures on the wall of his office of 3 eminent scientists, Isaac Newton, James Clerk Maxwell, and Michael Faraday. Newton was someone who believed in God. He wasn't a Christian in a traditional sense, but he was a believer in God. Michael Faraday was a clear Christian believer. So too was James Clerk Maxwell. In fact, he was an officer in a Presbyterian denomination, the very same denomination in which I serve. These eminent scientists saw no clash between Christianity and science. Come on to the modern day, and we meet someone like Francis Collins, the professor who led the project that mapped the human genome. He says the God of the Bible is the God of the genome. Similarly, James Conway Morris, who's a professor of paleobiology at Cambridge, argues there is simply no conflict between the God of the Bible and the God of science. In fact, to say you have to choose is to make a logical error, a philosophical mistake, we might say. Scientism wants to say that only science is allowed to give answers. But that's a very strange position to take. Earlier today, my children had pancakes for tea. If you were to say why, well, how might we answer? We might say, well, because flour and milk combined at a certain temperature over a hot metal pan, and the result will always be pancakes. There we go. That's a scientific explanation. But we could also say, well, my wife decided to make pancakes for tea. We might also say, we had pancakes because today is pancake day and it's traditional. All those explanations work. You don't have to choose between them. They simply function at different levels. To say you have to choose between science and Christianity, it is like saying you've got to choose who made the cake, the oven or the baker, who wrote Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling or a word processor. Both can be true, just at different levels. But back to the main point. You are, Christianity says, you are what God made you. You are intended and purposed. You're not here by accident. This is tremendously good news. The Bible tells us that there is a personal God out there. And therefore, when he makes human beings in his image, to use the Bible's phrase, he makes us personal. Again, materialism can't explain how we are personal, how we can love and think. And mysticism claims we can do those things, but with no rational explanation. Christianity says, yes, we can love, we can think, and the reason is that the origin of all things isn't an impersonal start, but a personal one, in the person of God. I think of atoms like these Lego blocks. It doesn't matter how many Lego blocks I stick together, they will never become personal. They'll never be able to think and love. Well, molecules are like Lego blocks, aren't they? Atoms are like Lego blocks. One atom isn't personal, 2 atoms aren't personal, 50 trillion atoms aren't personal. So it doesn't matter how many atoms you add together to make a human being, you'll never make a person. That's why materialism is such a depressing worldview. Christianity says, yes, we are made of these building blocks, and it encourages scientific explanation to understand the wonder of the human body, to make medical advances. But it says we're more than that. And not just building blocks, but also we have souls or spirits or minds. These are beyond the reach of the tools of scientific inquiry, but they are just as real. There is a real you there, in other words, that is created in the image of this great, rational, loving God. So we can think because we're made in the image of a God who thinks. We can love because we're made in the image of a God who is described as love in the Bible. There's a moment in the Narnia stories where this young boy Edmund meets a star. A star comes down and turns out to be this sort of celestial being, this person. And Edmund says, wow, in our universe, stars are just burning gas. And the star says to Edmund, in your universe, even in your universe, that is not what stars are, just what they're made of. We think when we've understood what we're made of, we've understood what we are, but we haven't. The good news is we are more than meat robots. That means we all have dignity. We all have value. And our value isn't found in how successful you are, or intelligent, or beautiful, or popular, or wealthy. Our value is found in the fact that we were made by a creator God who loves us and intended us. It's no wonder at the moment that so many of us feel broken and worthless, have incredible low self-esteem because we've been told we're just accidental byproducts of a blind universe. But no, this is Christianity. Someone made you. Someone loves you. Someone intended you. Someone created you. Of course, that leaves the question, why? Why did God make us? Why are we here? And that's the question we'll return to next time.